There is a specific kind of silence that falls over a city when the electrical grid dies all at once. It is not a peaceful silence. It is a heavy, pressurized silence. The hum of refrigerators stops. The streetlights vanish. The cellular towers blink out. At 1:14 a.m. last night, that silence fell over Caracas. For the residents of the city, it felt like just another blackout in a decade of blackouts. They likely sighed, rolled over in the heat, and waited for the backup generators to kick in. But this time, the generators didn't kick in. 30 minutes later, the silence was broken. Not by sirens, not by screaming, but by the low-frequency thrum of heavy transport aircraft cruising at low altitude, completely dark, without transponders. By the time the sun rose over the Avila Mountain this morning, the world had changed. The images flooding your timeline right now show smoke rising from the Miraflores Palace. They show American armored vehicles parked at the intersections of the Francisco Fajardo Highway. They show a man in a blue tracksuit being led onto a C-17 Globemaster by operators whose faces are blurred. The news channels are calling this Operation Liberty. They are calling it a restoration of democracy. They are using words like tyranny and freedom. But if you look closely at the operational details, if you look at what was seized and who is currently landing at the Maiquetía airport, you will realize that this is not a military invasion in the traditional sense. We are not witnessing a war. We are witnessing a foreclosure. We are watching the largest asset repossession in the history of finance. The bank has finally decided that the tenant is never going to pay, and they have come to change the locks. The question isn't, is the dictator gone? The question is, who owns the house now? Welcome. If you are watching this, you are probably looking for answers about what just happened in Venezuela. You want to know if this means World War III. You want to know if the oil price is going to crash. To answer those questions, we have to do something difficult. We have to turn off the political part of our brains. I am going to ask you to ignore the speeches you hear from the White House today. Ignore the protests in the streets. Ignore the moral arguments about sovereignty and imperialism. Because in the world of high-stakes macroeconomics, morality is a rounding error. Today, we are going to dissect the mechanism of this collapse. We are going to trace the specific financial incentives that turned the wealthiest nation in South America into a distressed asset ripe for hostile takeover. We will look at the Dutch disease that rotted the country's immune system. We will explain the currency arbitrage machine that turned generals into billionaires and soldiers into ghosts. And we will explain why the Casi Venezuela movement of 2024 was not a failed coup, but a successful market test for what happened last night. By the end of this video, you won't see a liberated country. You will see a liquidated balance sheet. To understand the foreclosure, we must first understand the mortgage. We need to go back to a specific moment in time, not to the rise of Chavez, but much further back. December 14th, 1922, the shores of Lake Maracaibo. At the time, Venezuela was a quiet, agricultural backwater. It exported coffee. It exported cocoa. It was poor, but it was structurally sound. The people were farmers. They ate what they grew. The economy was diversified because it had to be. Then, a drilling rig operated by Shell Oil, the Barroso No. 2, hit a pocket of high-pressure gas. The explosion blew the drilling tools out of the hole like bullets. For 9 days, a column of black crude oil shot 40 meters into the air. It rained petroleum on the roofs of the nearby village. It turned the streets into rivers of sludge. It was the largest oil gusher the world had ever seen. In that moment, the Venezuela of coffee and cocoa died, and a monster was born. Economists call what happened next the Dutch disease. The mechanism is simple but deadly. When you find a massive amount of natural resources, foreign money floods into your country to buy it. This makes your local currency extremely strong. On paper, this looks like wealth. In reality, it is a sterilization of your economy. Because your currency is so strong, it becomes cheaper to import everything than to produce anything. Why grow corn in the Venezuelan plains when you can import it from Iowa for pennies? Why make shoes in Caracas when you can import them from Italy? One by one, the factories closed, the farms went fallow, the skills were lost. By the 1970s, Venezuela wasn't a country with an oil industry. It was an oil company that possessed a national anthem and a flag. The state became the only provider. If you wanted to make money, you didn't start a business. You tried to get a government contract. You tried to get close to the valve. Fast forward to 1999. Hugo Chavez wins the presidency. The narrative says he ruined the economy with socialism. But that is too simple. What Chavez did was take a system that was already addicted to oil, and he removed the safety filters. He fired the technocrats at PDVSA, the state oil company. He replaced geologists with political loyalists. He replaced engineers with party members. He treated the oil wells like an ATM that would never run out of cash. He stopped investing in maintenance. He stopped exploring for new wells. He just pumped. And for a while, it worked. Oil hit $140 a barrel. The party was incredible. But he had dismantled the engine to sell the parts, all while driving the car at 100 miles per hour. Now we arrive at the true crime scene. This is the part that explains why the Venezuelan military didn't fight back last night. It is a mechanism called CADIVI. In 2003, the government implemented strict currency controls. They fixed the exchange rate. Let's say the official rate was 2 bolivars for $1. But in the real world, the street market, the demand for dollars was so high that the rate was 20 bolivars for $1. Do you see the gap? If you were a friend of the regime, you could buy $1 million from the central bank for 2 million bolivars. Then, you could walk across the street and sell those same dollars for 20 million bolivars. You just made an 18 million bolivar profit, instantly, risk-free. You didn't produce a product. You didn't hire a worker. This is called arbitrage, and it became the single biggest industry in Venezuela. It destroyed the moral fiber of the nation. Imagine you are a factory owner. Why would you struggle to make tires, dealing with unions, raw materials, and machinery for a 5% profit margin? It was smarter to shut down the factory and fire the workers. You would apply for $1 million to import tire rubber. You would pay a bribe to the official. You would get the dollars. You would import empty shipping containers, literally full of rocks or air, just to show the paperwork, and you would pocket the difference. This is why, for years, Venezuelan ports were full of containers that contained nothing. The entire economy became a simulation, and the biggest beneficiaries were the military. Chavez gave the military control over the imports. He put generals in charge of the ports. He put them in charge of the food distribution. He turned the armed forces into a cartel. The cartel of the Suns wasn't just about drug trafficking, although that was part of it. It was about currency trafficking. This explains the mystery of why the regime survived for so long. People always asked, why doesn't the military overthrow Maduro? The soldiers are hungry too. The answer is simple incentives. If you are a high-ranking general, you are making millions of dollars a month through this arbitrage. You have condos in Miami. You have accounts in Andorra. If you overthrow Maduro, the game ends. The arbitrage stops. You might go to jail. So the military became the Praetorian Guard of the exchange rate. Quick pause. We are wading through some pretty dense economic forensics here. If you are still watching, it means you prefer the uncomfortable mechanics of how the world works over the comforting slogans of political theater. Most people don't want to know about currency arbitrage. They just want to know who the bad guy is so they can move on. I don't do that here. A lot of you watching aren't subscribed. That is fine. Trust is a hard asset, and it takes time to accumulate. But if this kind of breakdown, where we look at the balance sheet rather than the ballot box, is useful to you, subscribing helps signal to the algorithm that there is still a market for attention spans longer than 15 seconds. All right, let's get back to the collapse. The arbitrage machine worked beautifully as long as dollars were flowing in, and dollars flowed in as long as oil was expensive. Then came 2014. The price of oil collapsed. Almost overnight, the revenue of Venezuela was cut in half. Then it was cut again. The government faced a choice. They could stop the arbitrage game, devalue the currency, and try to rebuild the productive economy. Or They could keep the game going by printing money. They chose to print. The central bank began to monetize the deficit on a scale never seen in the Western Hemisphere. This is where the tragedy becomes visceral. We have all seen the photos, piles of cash dumped in the gutter, people weighing banknotes instead of counting them. But the mechanism of hyperinflation is more than just big numbers. It is the destruction of time. When inflation hits 130,000%, you cannot plan for next month. You can only plan for today. A doctor's monthly salary became enough to buy a carton of eggs. A university professor's pension became enough to buy a single cup of coffee. The incentives for honest work evaporated. If you worked a legitimate job, you starved. If you entered the black market, selling gas, selling dollars, selling yourself, you survived. And here, the regime made its final, fatal pivot. They realized they could no longer pay for loyalty with oil money, so they allowed the country to be cannibalized. They opened the Arco Minero, the mining arc, a massive zone in the Amazon rainforest, rich in gold and rare earth minerals. They effectively handed this territory over to criminal gangs, the ELN guerrillas, and the military. They said, "Go ahead, dig, destroy the jungle, poison the rivers with mercury, keep the gold, just keep us in power." Venezuela ceased to be a state. It became an extraction pit. This was the state of the asset in 2024. A hollow shell, a population of 7 million refugees spread across the continent. A government that was really just a holding company for various criminal enterprises. And sitting on top of it all, the largest oil reserves in the world, idle, rusting, waiting. Now we need to talk about the precursor to last night. We need to talk about the Casi Venezuela movement of late 2024. At the time, the media treated it as a curiosity, a website launched by Eric Prince, a countdown clock, a donation button, vote with your dollars to overthrow the regime. It felt like a scam, or a publicity stunt. But in hindsight, it was something much more important. It was a market test. It was a proof of concept for the privatization of regime change. It demonstrated that the Venezuelan diaspora was willing to fund a kinetic intervention. It normalized the idea that Venezuela's sovereignty was conditional. It turned the country from a political problem to a security project. And then came the geopolitical pivot of 2025. The Middle East exploded. Supply chains from Asia became unreliable. The United States suddenly realized that having a hostile, chaotic, Russia-aligned state sitting on the Caribbean coast was no longer just an annoyance. It was an unacceptable strategic liability. The calculation changed. The cost of invasion was high, but the cost of inaction became higher. And that brings us to the logistics of last night. The operation that launched at 1 a.m. was not designed to conquer territory. It was designed to sever the head of the snake and secure the assets. Notice the targets. The airstrikes didn't hit the barrios. They didn't hit the civilian infrastructure. They hit the command and control nodes of the military. They hit the Russian-installed air defense radars, and they hit the runways. The cyber attack that killed the grid was precise. It disconnected the Miraflores Palace from the military commands in the provinces. General Pedrino Lopez, the head of the armed forces, wasn't captured. Rumors are already circulating that he is on a plane to Turkey, or perhaps he is sitting in a safe house in Caracas, having cut a deal. Remember the arbitrage? The U.S. likely offered the ultimate arbitrage deal to the generals. Give us Maduro, and you get to keep your money. Fight us, and we seize your accounts in Switzerland. It was a rational economic decision. The generals sold their CEO to save their equity. When the Delta Force teams breached the residence, they weren't fighting loyalists. They were collecting a package. The image of Nicolás Maduro in handcuffs isn't a symbol of justice. It is a receipt. So, what happens now? The United States has declared a transitional authority. This is simply a polite word for receivership. When a corporation goes bankrupt, a receiver is appointed by the court. The receiver's job is not to be nice. The receiver's job is to liquidate assets to pay off creditors. The U.S. military is the receiver. PDVSA is the asset. The creditors are the bondholders in Wall Street who haven't been paid since 2017. The oil majors like Chevron, who want their concessions back, and the Western geopolitical alliance. The rebuilding of Venezuela will not be a charity project. It will be a business venture. We are about to see the greatest privatization drive in Latin American history. The oil fields will be auctioned off. The gold mines will be regularized. For the Venezuelan people, this is a moment of complex emotions. There is relief, certainly. But there is also the realization that their country no longer belongs to them. They are tenants in a renovated building, and the rent is about to go up. Expect an insurgency. The colectivos, the armed gangs in the slums, were not part of the deal the generals made. They have nothing to lose. The urban warfare in Caracas over the next 6 months will be brutal. There is a dark lesson here for the rest of the world. We like to believe in the fiction of the nation-state. We like to believe that borders are real and that sovereignty is sacred. But the story of Venezuela teaches us the cold physics of the real world. If you mismanage your economy for long enough, if you destroy your own capacity to produce, if you alienate your population and turn your government into a criminal enterprise, you lose the right to be a sovereign nation. You become an asset. And in a world of scarce resources, assets do not stay ownerless for long. Venezuela thought it could opt out of the global financial system. It thought it could play by its own rules. But gravity always wins. The foreclosure is complete. The sign is in the yard, and the new management is already moving in. The events in Caracas are still unfolding, and the financial ripple effects are going to hit the markets on Monday morning. This foreclosure is just the first chapter of a much longer liquidation process. I will be tracking the flow of assets and the restructuring of debt as the dust settles. If you want to understand the balance sheet of the New World Order, stick around. I'll see you in the next one.